Good afternoon, or possibly good morning or good evening, and welcome to today's virtual retro seminar. My name is Alan Morrison. I'm Professor of Law and Finance at the Saïd Business School, and I'm joined today by Rita Mota, who's the Intesa Sanpaolo Research Fellow at the Saïd Business School and who convenes these seminars with me, and by our speaker, Guido Palazzo. Guido is Professor of Business Ethics at HEC Lausanne. He's well known for his work on globalization, especially for his work on human rights violations in global value chains, as well as for his work on the reasons that people behave unethically in organizations. He's very widely published in, amongst others, the Academy of Management Review, the Academy of Management Journal, the Journal of Management Studies, Business Ethics Quarterly, and the Journal of Business Ethics. He sits on several editorial boards, and he is a past recipient of the Max Weber Award for his work on multinational corporations. We're very excited to have him here with us today. I'm going to turn the floor over to Guido in a moment, but before I do so, I'll make a few quick remarks about the seminar. If you're a regular attendee, you'll have heard something like this before. Retro, that is Reputation, Ethics, Trust and Relationships at Oxford, is a seminar series that's concerned with the ethical and normative content of trust and reputation in organizational life. It's one of a wide range of seminars and conferences that occurs with the generous support of the Centre for Corporate Reputation, which is an interdisciplinary research centre directed by Rupert Younger here at the Saïd Business School in Oxford. Retro has been an online seminar since the onset of the COVID-19 crisis, and the online format turned out to be such a good way to stimulate conversations amongst people from all over the world that Rita and I decided to retain it, even as many activities in the Academy are starting to happen in person again. Making Retro happen, however, is quite hard work when it's online, especially. And I'd like to thank all of the people who contributed to the effort. In particular, thank you to Rupert Younger, who's director of the CCR, and to Chris Page, Mark Hughes Morgan, and Darius Zalia. I'm also particularly grateful to Rita, whose energy, ideas, and expertise are absolutely essential to the success of these seminars. So, on for today. The Reputation Centre is concerned with the ways that people evaluate each other's performance in social life generally and in organizational life in particular. Guido's talk talks about matters that are very central to this sort of evaluation. He asks whether our views of what is appropriate and true, and hence the things that inform reputation formation, are driven by rational thought. Of course, most theories only make sense in the context of some way of understanding how the world works. Guido argues that if we want to understand social life, then we need to understand the narrative structure of those understandings. This work has massive implications for the way that we think about big social problems. For example, it can probably help us to think carefully about the sorts of big questions that are being addressed at COP26 this week. I think we're going to have a fascinating seminar. Because the seminar is well attended, we have to be quite formal about the Q&A format. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box and not into the chat, and either Rita or I will relay them to Guido. He's going to speak for about 25 minutes, give or take, and after that, I hope we can have a reasonably wide-ranging discussion. As usual, we're going to finish promptly at 5 o'clock UK time. So, Guido, thank you again for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you also for the invitation, Rita, for contacting me. I will share my screen so that you can see my slides, my presentation. I assume it works. You can see my slides.
Yep.
Maybe I start by telling you what I'm not going to do in the next 25 minutes. I'm not going to present a paper because this is rather a slow science project, a book project on which I'm working, the core idea of that. And I'm not going to talk about something that we all know already, the fact that maybe the last 20 years, climate scientists have not been good storytellers and should become better storytellers. This would be a bit banal for a presentation, but it's maybe the surface of what I'm going to share with you. Let me start with this, that some of you might not have seen yet, a paper that came out more or less 2 weeks ago, and that took the 88,000 climate-related papers published, a sample of that, a representative sample, and concluded that there's now a 99% consensus that climate change is caused by us, by our behavior, and should also be tackled by our behavior. Now, this is probably not disputed among us here. And there's also a broad consensus out there that something has to change. We have built a civilization based on a world that doesn't exist anymore. A climate scientist in The Guardian last month. And Angela Merkel said something very similar and quite radical for a politician in February 2020, so 4 weeks before COVID hit Europe. In the next 30 years, we have to learn to leave behind the entire way of business and life that we got used to during the industrial age. Well, while it seems that we all agree that something has to be done and has to be done urgently, a third quote gives us a quite different perspective on the situation. And that quote is coming from a colleague of us, a professor of management, who said this in a PhD seminar during the SMS, the Strategic Management Conference last October. We are 15 years away from seeing real concern about these issues. She was reacting to the question of why don't we see more papers on such kind of topics in management journals. We're 15 years away from this. So if we take this together, we have 30 years left and 15 years we will still need to figure out that this is relevant. That doesn't give us a quite optimistic perspective. And this is somehow also confirmed by some recent data. What you see here is the bouncing back of consumption after COVID. And bouncing back is maybe not the right term, because what you see here is that sales in the USA do not just bounce back to the level before. Actually, we accelerate, or they accelerate, the Americans accelerate. We consume more than ever before. So for me, the question in recent years that led me to reorient my own research a bit was that, well, if we all know that we have to change fast and have to change drastically, why don't we see that change happen? Or why don't we see that change happen faster in a more coherent way? What keeps us from changing? And in order to answer that question, I would like to invite you briefly to come with me back into the history of the philosophy of language, to a place close to Oxford, but not as good as Oxford, probably, Cambridge. Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian philosopher, who became famous twice for saying something in the first place and then saying the opposite later on. What he said in the first place was that as scientists, what we do is we create a picture of the world. So we take our theories, we try to create a pure language. And with that pure language, we understand the world. It's as if what we write down becomes a picture of what's going on out there, which made him the poster child of the Vienna Circle dream of social scientists becoming real natural scientists. Well, Wittgenstein, when he had finished that book, he left Cambridge because he thought that now everything had been said in philosophy, and from now on there would be no philosophy anymore, which was a little bit presumptuous. And he had a collapse a few years after he wrote this book because he saw this drawing in a German humoristic magazine. And he realized that his theory was wrong by looking at this drawing. Because what he realized was, if you looked into one direction, from left to right, he saw a rabbit. But if he looked from right to left, he saw a duck. The reality remained unchanged in the sense of the facts out there. But what changed was the perception of that in his mind. In fact, in order to see the rabbit, he had to make an effort not to see the duck. So what he realized was that there is not one language which we can use to describe the world. We have language games. And he wrote this second book, which was published posthumous after he had died in 1953, the philosophical investigation. So while with the first book, he became the role model, the reference point of positivism, this second book kicked off the linguistic turn and the constructivist world perception. Now, what is constructivism? Whenever I discuss this with natural scientists, they sometimes get a bit angry because they think this means we dispute the existence of the world out there. But that's not the case. So let me tell you what I believe constructivism is about. What you see here on this photo is a Yukon Gorge cave in Australia. And of course, there's no discussion that this exists, that there is rock, that there is something we can investigate with the means of geology and with the means of biology. But for the Aboriginals, this cave was for 46,000 years a ritual sacred place where they went to pray, and an important element in their landscape of holy places in Australia. For Rio Tinto, it was an expansion of an ore mine, and they blew it up with dynamite. Now, what is real? What is true? Constructivism does not challenge the existence of a real world. What it does is it argues that the symbolic layer of imagined things is at least as important as the real world out there. How we see the world, how we interpret this, is what makes us act. It's not the cave as such. So what scientists learned over recent years is something very painful, especially for natural scientists. They learned that the truth as such is flat. If there is no narrative around the truth, around the facts, these facts have no relevance and no impact. So we think in narratives, we think in stories, and this has been obvious since decades already. A paper published in 1944 by Haider and Simmel, where they showed people these drawings and they asked them, what do you see? And guess what happens? People do not only see a link between these random pictures, they start to tell a story about a person living in a house and two people coming visit, whatever. So they invent a story. We are hardwired for storytelling. We perceive the world along narratives. And we can trace this back to the very beginning of Homo sapiens. What you see here is a figure made of ivory, roughly 30 centimeters high. It's called Lion Man. It has been found in southern Germany. It has the body of a human being and the head of a cave lion. Experimental archaeologists tried to figure out how long it took to build that figure, that statue. And they calculated it took an expert artist 250 hours to build it. Now, 30,000 years ago, Homo sapiens in Europe is hunting and gathering. They're struggling to make both ends meet every day. And now we have to imagine that they release someone, at least one person, from work to produce art. They found that in the mouth of that lion, there were seeds, and the mouth of the lion itself was polished. So probably people touched it a lot. There must have been a ritual around this. We don't know the story of Lion Man. It has never been written down. But what we know is that this story was so important for them that it was on the same level as food. We as a species are a storytelling animal. And the story is something that is at the core of how we make decisions every day. So what is our narrative? Our narrative, the beginning of the 21st century in the Western world, and we can even say a globalized narrative since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Maybe I start by two quotes. Lloyd Blankfein, the then CEO of Goldman Sachs, said this when his company was attacked for the financial crisis, in which they had been an actor who fueled what happened, and they predicted what happened and betted on the opposite of what they told their customers to do. He said just that to justify his company and his own work. I'm doing God's work. He saw himself as a kind of mechanism of something bigger than him. The free market, of course. George W. Bush, father, said this a while ago: the American way of life is not up for negotiation. That's another element of our story. Just to show you, that is the American way of life, or our way of life, which starts pretty much after World War II, where the Earth system trends and the trends of consumption and production accelerate and become nonlinear in large aspects. It seems that the narratives in which we are embedded make us very difficult for us to imagine something different, a different world, a different type of routines and action. So what is our narrative? And it's, by the way, something we have taught in business schools around the world, at least since the 1960s, 70s. We don't have time to go through all of them, but let me give you, in a nutshell, what I believe is the Western narrative. Humans are born bad. They're self-interested, utility maximizing, and as Williamson would claim, even opportunistic. So we are even willing to break contracts, to break promises if there is an opportunity. Markets are magical. They translate self-interest into welfare and freedom. Competition, not cooperation, is the default, the natural default of our behavior. Property rights are the most important human right. Regulation is bad. Governments are part of the problem. Growth is always good and eternally possible. We progress through science. There's always a technological solution. And consumption makes us happy. As I said, in 1989, when the wall of Berlin came down, we globalized this. So we have to add one aspect, which is we can scale this up. If you look at all these elements that we are teaching, again, in economics, in management, in finance, since decades, if you look for the evidence of that narrative, I would argue that the evidence, the empirical evidence, is probably as thin as for linemen or any other kind of narrative. It's a belief system. And a belief system is always mixing some facts with some norms. So we can never say it's totally wrong, but it's never an appropriate description of the world. It's a mix. Hannah Arendt made this observation that is very important to understand why these narratives are so consistent and so change resistant. What convinces masses are not facts, not even invented facts, but only the consistency of the system of which they are presumably a part. And this system here that I'll show to you is very consistent. It's a very consistent narrative where the elements fit together in an ideal way. It's just not right. That's the problem. So when we look into our current society, we see a crisis of how we should make sense of the world. And that crisis has led to a return of a way of thinking that was, for more than 100 years, perceived as no longer to be taken seriously. I'm speaking of holism, not necessarily Hegelian holism. There was an article in Aeon last week about him and his approach, but holism in general. Because what we have had as the approach to science since the beginning of the Vienna Circle, early 20th century, and probably even further down drilling to Descartes, is the idea that we understand the world by looking always deeper into details, analytical science, atomistic foundationalism, as it was called as well. And what we understand now is that, yes, we understand something about the world by this approach, but we lose a lot by not looking at how things are building systems, how we can look at them holistically. And one philosopher who recently has moved center stage with his approach is a student of Richard Rorty, Robert Brandom, who developed a language-based new interpretation of Hegelian holism by saying, well, we have to understand the world as one that is shaped by the communication structures we create. And in these structures, sentences refer to sentences. Meaning is never understood by looking at one piece. We have to understand meaning as something that comes from the network of inferences that we build in a particular context. And these inferences, they build the basis, the foundation for the commitments, the beliefs, and the causal claims we make. Something that Quine has already said much earlier. He called this the web of beliefs. And if in a web of beliefs you change something, that change will have an impact on all the other beliefs. Just to give you a simple example, if you are a fundamental Christian and you believe that God made the world in 6 days and then he had 1 day free, and scientists come and tell you, we found that humans influence the climate in a way that we are about to destroy the planet, they cannot believe this. Because if they believe that fact, their entire web of beliefs that they hold would collapse. They have to make a choice between the scientific evidence of this study, which they probably do not even understand, and their entire way of life, their identity, their network of friends, their social network in which they're embedded. They would all lose these things if they would just switch to the science. It doesn't fit into the web of beliefs. And you see the same kind of thinking emerging in linguistics and anthropology. So this idea that we have to look at the world through a narrative, use this as a vantage point to understand the entire thing, either a linguistic a scholar or Everett, an anthropologist, said we have to look at the gestalt, the coherent percept of how the world is organized linguistically in a particular historical moment. And that world is not organized for you and me, so we can just claim, well, I don't believe in this narrative that you just showed to me, but that's not relevant because there is this implicit ideal reader, as Schorke, the linguist, said, and it is written for this idealist reader. So we all somehow are connected to this narrative, even if we do not believe it word by word, and we enact it as societies. Now, the point where we are is problematic because the narrative that I just showed to you is collapsing. It's collapsing from various angles: the ecological crisis, the crisis of individual identity, the polarization of society. So from various angles, we start to challenge this neoliberal narrative. And the question is, what happens when a narrative ends? So I would look at the ecological crisis, not so much through the lens of natural phenomena that we can observe. I would look at it through the perspective of a narrative crisis. We are disoriented. We do not know any longer how to interpret the world. Jonathan Lear, the philosopher, has written a book about this recently, where he took an American native nation, the Crows, and he used them to show what happens if in a culture, in a civilization, the entire network of concepts, of rituals, of meaning-making collapses. Of course, one thing that happens is very obvious. We confuse the end of a narrative with the end of the world. And we are not the first ones, and it has happened again and again in history. Whenever a narrative comes to an end, people believe the world is going to end. But what really happens is what Antonio Gramsci wrote down in the prison notebooks in the 1930s. We said, well, we maybe are in an interregnum, in a place between two narratives, I would say, where the old belief system is no longer giving orientation, while we haven't built up a new one yet that we could follow. And when that situation arrives, according to him, all kind of morbid symptoms appear. And we see that. We see that around us, and we wonder how we could ever become so irrational as societies. Well, the answer is probably we are in a narrative crisis. And whenever you look back in history, in a narrative crisis, people become irrational. So I'm not so much concerned about this phenomenon. It will disappear when the crisis of narrative disappears. So the answer for me is to the crisis is not explain the facts better. The answer is something that Hegel already wrote down long ago. We must have a new mythology, but one built on reason, not one built on random stuff like probably Lion Man was built on. A mythology of reason. To put differently, we have to re-narrate our world. And of course, when we re-narrate the world, the question is, what kind of material do we have at our disposition to do so? Sometimes people ask me, if you could travel in time, where would you go? And my answer is always, I would go to this meeting in the summer of 1797 in a garden in Jena in Germany. You probably know the two guys left and right, Goethe and Schiller, but I'm more interested now in these two guys, Wilhelm and Alexander von Humboldt, who came with an alternative narrative early on, also inspired by Schiller and Goethe. And this narrative is simply saying, well, we should not look at individual analytical facts like we learned from Descartes and others in the Enlightenment. We should look at the connections. Alexander von Humboldt was a natural scientist. Wilhelm von Humboldt was a linguist and a politician, and both came to the same understanding of the world in their different fields, namely the idea that we have to look in between things, to look at the networks. We have to have a holistic view, as Hegel would later describe it in his work. And you see this popping up everywhere right now, the last 20, 30 years. The idea that we should not look at individual minds, individual sentences, individual genes. We have to look in between. We have to look at genetics as a social change process, at language as a social thing, at cognition, not as something happening in our mind, as Kahneman would say, but something happened in between people, and so on. So this is the return of an old thinking of von Humboldt, and I don't have the time to go deeper here, but just to give you a glimpse of that. And Alexander von Humboldt is coming back again with these theories about the planet as a fragile, self-regulatory system, where if you manipulate something in one corner, you might influence something in another corner. Bruno Latour recently made that point. This requires a totally different way of thinking, a new way of looking at agency. Why not putting a river into a stakeholder debate, a dolphin into a stakeholder debate, a forest, a mountain? This is what's starting to happen around us right now. So this is an emerging practice, starting with this first river that was declared a legal person in New Zealand in 2017. So to sum it up, what I believe is we do not need to better narrate climate change. Also, we have to do that, but we have to do something much more important. We have to narrate a different civilization. Artists are very often earlier in understanding where things are developing or developing new ideas. And I guess James Cameron, when he did Avatar, he showed that. What we see in these books by Latour and others emerging in theory, he showed that in a story. So let me stop my sharing. I'm happy to discuss now. Thank you.
Thank you, Guido. It's a shame you only had 25 minutes. That was fascinating. And, an awful lot of things there that hopefully we can develop a bit as we get into the Q&A. We have a reasonably large audience, so can I encourage people to type their questions into the Q&A, and Peter and I will relay them to Guido. I wanted to start, Guido, by just, I had a bunch of questions, so I'm going to pick one, and we'll see if we have time for any more of them. I want to get a bit more into the relationship between narrative and physics, for want of a better word. And you said at one point that we need a new mythology that's built on reason. And I'm trying to understand how that reason connects to the physical world without a narrative starting point. So given that your claim is that narratives are, I think you're claiming that narratives hang together when they're logically consistent, you might argue that reason is simply a matter of coming up with a logically consistent narrative. And I can fit what's happening in the physical world into all sorts of logically consistent narratives that I find utterly implausible. How do I know which of those utterly consistent narratives are reasonable?
I would say two things here. Well, first, as I mentioned, any narrative at any time is a mix of some real world evidence and some fiction. There's no narrative that has no fictitious elements. Now, if you want to figure out which one is a narrative that makes sense and is reasonable enough, fact-based enough, I would just sit and wait, right? So if I would tell you, I heard voices from aliens that tell me we can fly and we all jump out of the window, that narrative dies in that very moment because it doesn't have any evolutionary meaning and value. But what we see is that the analytical story that we were sharing with the Enlightenment, so drill in the details, then you understand the world, is not wrong, but it's only half of what we could narrate. The other half is, well, look at what forests do. Forests, you understand not by looking at one tree and then analyze the tree. You understand this by looking at how they are connected through fungi, how they send messages to each other, how they cooperate interspecies, and so on. So there is something you don't see if you have an analytical approach. Now, the forest can be a symbol, a very powerful symbol for a new narrative, because it touches our hearts. We love forests. And forests are also part of the solution for the climate crisis. And they are a metaphor for how we can see our own social interaction, switching from the default of competition to the default of cooperation. Just imagine what kind of world we might have if we had taught in our business schools the last 50, 60 years that cooperation is the default and not competition.
I guess the point I'm making is that, and I'm sympathetic to the conclusion you want to draw, I just want to get there in a way that I understand. So if I teach people that cooperation is better than competition, presumably I'm appealing to some value judgment or some narrative. And in order to justify that value judgment or narrative, I think by your account, I need another value judgment or narrative. And I want to know where this process bottoms out. Can I just appeal to some notion of virtue, or can I make a theological argument, or is there some point at which these arguments just seem more reasonable than others, and that's where we stop?
I think that it's very difficult to answer, because in my view, we are the first time in human history at a point where we consciously have to craft a narrative. Narratives just emerged in the past. So they new narratives came up, they resonated with some needs people saw, and then they emerged and were winning against existing ones that were dominating so far. So it was a kind of natural selection. We can really take a biological perspective here. Now we have to create a new one. And that brings us to this dilemma that as soon as I create it, I don't believe it, because I have created it. We have to, what Coleridge said, switch off our disbelief at one point. And we are in that dilemma. And I don't know how we will do this, but I think we have to do this. We have to find a way of creating a narrative that touches our hearts and which we believe, which is fact-based, and where in the moment where we believe it, we switch off any doubt that this is a narrative. We don't look at it as a narrative anymore. To answer your point, I see a lot of storytelling happening right now. A lot of threads, story threads coming up and emerging. And again, this happened in history again and again. If you take this historical perspective, when Jesus, if he existed, was preaching in Israel, there were tons of other people saying crazy stuff. So Monty Python was not that far away from reality. And they were all saying random things about the end of the world and what we should have to, and they were losing. And his story was winning. Why? Random stuff. St. Paul traveling to Rome. Rome having a crisis. This new narrative speaking to people being vulnerable to that kind of situation which they were in that old society. The poor, the women, the slaves. So a lot of random things happen when new narratives come up. There's a competition of narratives, and some win and some lose. But again, we are the first generation, maybe in the entire human species, that has to create the narrative.
Okay, thank you. Rita.
Thanks, Peter. Fascinating talk. I think I can speak for everyone when I say that this is extremely thought-provoking. We already have a lot of questions coming in from the audience, but I'd like to ask you one of my own and perhaps mix it up with another one that came from one of the people watching us. So I was struck by the fact that you used so many examples or a few examples from indigenous culture. And that made me think, okay, so the narrative that you're talking about here is essentially the narrative of the global north. And if we want to find something along the lines of what you have been describing as what we need, we don't really need to look that far, because a lot of the indigenous cultures around the world already defend the sorts of ideals that you've been talking about, and especially when it comes to the climate crisis. I mean, indigenous peoples are the custodians of most of the biodiversity around the world. They have a completely different relationship to the natural world than we do in the global north. And I guess my question for you is, do you think that it's possible for the global north to have the humility to accept that maybe indigenous people were right all along, and to go back to that? Or do you think that there's too much destruction already so that people can go back to something like that? And I would supplement that with a question from Ana Maria Tuan, which I think is related. So she's asking if you could tell us a little bit more about the impact of a changing narrative on emerging countries. So what do you think is their narrative, and how do you think that they can deal with the changing Western narrative? What's the impact for emerging countries?
Maybe my first reaction is, that's why I moved the computer a bit, because the book was lying under my computer. The recent book of Graeber and Wengrow, David Graeber's book before he died, The Dawn of Everything. What he does in this book is he showed that we got it all wrong when we look at human history, and that the Enlightenment philosophers, Voltaire and others, were basically informed and inspired by Native American, among others, philosophers, thinkers, wisdom. So we have in the past seen that kind of influence. And even for the Humboldt brothers, you can make that claim, at least for Alexander von Humboldt, because he was traveling there. He was seeing those narratives in practice. So I think this mutual inspiration is there. It has always been there. Now, for this question from the audience, I think that a lot of narratives emerged from the periphery. The Christian narrative emerged from the periphery, from losers in a remote place far away from Rome, but winning against the mythology in Rome at one point. So you can at any point trace a line between the ones who come with a new idea and their social status. So most of the time, they're somewhere on the periphery. Their story is under pressure. It's taken for rubbish, and it's not taken serious. And then over time they win. Some of them, not always. Now, another element where I'm not sure what the answer is can we just take narrative material from other cultures and point at it here in Europe and say, look, the American native tribes had this already. Here is the 7th generation concept or whatever. Let's apply this. I don't know whether this works, because material has to be appropriated. It has somehow to come from who you are already. You cannot just take stuff from other narratives and implement it in your own world. I'm not so sure whether that works. So I think we have to find the traces of what other people outside our world have said long ago. We have to find those traces in our own culture. That's why I go to the Humboldt brothers. I don't go to Native American tribes, which I could as well. I think our story that we know, the narrative that we need, is a continuation of who we are. You see this when you look back in history. The scientific narrative is emerging step by step out of the Christian narrative of the Middle Ages. The Christian narrative is step by step liberating itself from the Roman mythology. The Roman mythology itself is a child of the Greek mythology, and so on. So you can make these links and see that it's building up over time. So again, I'm not so sure whether you can inject just something from outside and say, let's believe that now. We must somehow have it in our genes, narrative genes already.
But I guess when you attribute legal personality to a river, for example, you're already doing that a little bit. Mm-hmm. You're formalizing something that corresponds quite directly to most indigenous people's beliefs about what rivers are, what nature is.
Yes, and new narratives are always compromises. The Christians, when they conquered Rome, took over a lot of the rituals and beliefs and practices of the ancient Romans. They just included them in their own narrative, reframed them, reinterpreted them. But it was a kind of appropriation of what they found. So we somehow have to tell the new narrative in a way that it's not totally alien to what we believe right now. It has to connect. Otherwise, it doesn't resonate.
Yeah, thank you. Alan.
Right, we have so many questions coming in. They're so good that I'm going to combine 4 of them because they ask very similar.
Then I have to take notes.
No, I'll make it brief for you. I think there's one question by Geraldine Woolley, 2 by Seth Jensen, 1 from Mislav Radic. We'll make sure you get copies of all of these questions and the accompanying comments, but they're really talking about the people who tell stories, how narratives take hold, and who tells the story and the media in which they tell the stories. So presumably if a new narrative is required and we're in a situation where the old narrative is breaking or ending, a number of alternative narratives will emerge. And inevitably, in some sense, they compete. And then there are interesting questions about whether the source of a narrative matters. So is a narrative more likely to succeed if it comes from someone who is a more powerful speaker? And if that's the case, presumably more powerful is a status that was accorded someone as a consequence of a pre-existing narrative. So there are kind of weird and interesting path dependency questions here. And relatedly, both Seth and Mislav asked about media in general. And how do these stories get told? Are algorithms going to have an unexpected impact? Does the way that we engage with social media affect the way the narratives take hold? Do media matter in general? That's the sort of who tells a story, how do they tell it, and does the power of the storyteller matter?
Very good questions. I don't think that the power of the storyteller matters, and that might be a bit surprising. If someone is a Foucauldian, he might think that, or she might think that this is naive. But if you look back, again, if you take the long historical perspective, the new stories, the new narratives, they emerged through the voices of not powerful, but peripheral speakers. St. Paul, St. Peter in Rome. The scientists in the Middle Ages were not part of the powerful community. They were on the margin of that. Someone like Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo Galilei, they were threatened by the powerful. But narratives change, not because more powerful people tell new narratives. They change because existing narratives do no longer resonate with what people experience in their daily life. That's important. And what we see, again, when we look back, is that a pandemic is very often accelerating and fueling the end of a narrative. It doesn't cause it, but it fuels it if the narrative is already in crisis. The feudal system in Europe disappeared with a plague. The Spanish flu was a driving force of the Second World War. And so the Roman Empire collapsed in a pandemic. Again, not because of the pandemic, but something is wrong. People feel that. We don't believe anymore what we are told. So we listen to new voices. Greta Thunberg is one of them, and she's certainly not a powerful speaker. She is a little schoolgirl, right? So, and she was able to mobilize millions of people around the world before the pandemic hit. And that is not because of her power. That's because people feel that what she is saying is somehow pointing at the problems that they all perceive but were not able to formulate. Someone finally comes and brings new words, a new language, like the Romantic poets did in the first criticism of capitalism a few hundred years ago. People with a new narrative need new words. These new words describe exactly what people feel. It resonates with them. Now, what the new media do with that, that's an important question, and I don't have an answer. What I see is that the big changes, they always come, and Peter Drucker has shown this already, the big changes in our narratives, they always come with new information technologies, with new ways of telling stories. The book print changed the world. The alphabet was responsible, the invention of the alphabet was responsible for the enlightenment, so to speak, of the ancient Greek. And so will the internet change the way we think and connect and speak and make sense of the world. We are no longer the linear storytellers that Gutenberg created, the Homo Gutenbergensis, as Marshall McLuhan calls us. We are becoming something different. What that is, I don't know. But what we see again is the opposite at the moment: polarization, irrationalities, random stuff that people believe. But the same happened in the Middle Ages when books were started to be printed. So I am not worried about that. But what the impact will be, I don't know.
Thanks. I think I will do the same as Alan and pull two of the questions from the audience and ask them together. So one of them, they're both about the impact of changing narratives and the role that specific actors or groups of actors have in this change that we've been talking about. Judith Strolle is asking specifically about management. She's pointing out that there is one myth that is very pervasive, both in business schools and in the business world out there. The idea that we can only manage what we measure, and so quantification appears as this silver bullet for things that we don't really understand. And Judith is asking if you could explore the importance of narratives for management, especially in the context of the climate crisis in a world on fire. And then we have a question also from Yves Fassin, and Yves is asking about academia and pointing out that there is quite a lot of competition going on in academia for things like publications, promotions, Nobel Prizes. Are we doing what we need to do? Are we fulfilling our role in this changing narrative when everything that about the way academia functions is so deeply connected, obviously and necessarily, to the dominant narrative that we've been having so far?
Mm-hmm. Very good questions again. This morning I was teaching a class to my master students on Amazon, and there is one quote from a vice president finance of Amazon who once said, "Data is liberating. Data is liberating." And I would like to pick that up to answer this question about measurement. Why are we so focused now on measurement, probably more than ever before with big data? When the Middle Ages had this crisis of narratives that we have right now, when Americas were discovered, we understood we are not the center of the world anymore, and all kind of new knowledge came up, and the old belief systems was just falling apart. The church was split. The 30 Years' War started. And there was one guy in that 30 Years' War who was wondering, how can we get out of this irrationality that is growing around us? René Descartes. And he said there's one way out. We have to find something that we all share, despite our different belief systems. And guess what he found? He found mathematics and reason. We measure. What we can measure, we cannot dispute. We can agree on the things we measure. Data is liberating in that sense. It liberates us from our disputes. Of course, it's not true, but that is what we believed at that point, and that is returning now. And no surprise, because we are again in a time that is perceived as uncertain. It creates anxieties and fears, and we don't know what's going on. How do we find an answer? Data, the new media, liberating us from that pressure. So I think as business schools, we should be really critically thinking about the role of measurement in the debate. But not only that, I mean, we have to entirely change what we are teaching. Otherwise, we will disappear. I guess in a decade from now on, if we still teach what we teach today, we will have lost our entire legitimacy. Which leads me to this other question of Yves about academics. I would say that the way we are designing the production of knowledge is not helping. It is not getting us out of the situation, because we are trained and we are incentivized and we are forced to publish small little papers with small little questions and small little answers. The paper game is not giving us holistic answers, because if you try something holistic, that doesn't get published. It's too big, it's too unusual, it doesn't fit in. So that was, for me, the reason why I decided not to write papers anymore. I think it's useless. It doesn't help. It doesn't solve the problems of this planet. We need bolder and bigger ideas, and that are not typically the ideas that get published in papers. So I think we have to rethink our own system, how we measure success, how we measure impact, how we decide on tenure with these references, citations, and Google Scholar and impact factors. That all has nothing to offer when it comes to the ecological crisis, in my view.
Thank you. Alan?
I'm going to give you a question that Itzhak Costello has typed into the Q&A. If I remember rightly, she was the first of our online speakers. She was certainly a very early one. She says, thanks for the great talk. She wants to ask about emotion and the role of emotion in all of this. So you said, it's a really nice question to think about. You said that we need a new mythology or new narrative that's built on reason, which is where my first question came from. But she's asking whether actually, given that an awful lot of counter-narratives now appear to have quite a lot of emotion built into them, what's the relationship between the two? And I presume you're going to say something like emotions are often very rational, but I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on this.
If you think back at the first decades of capitalism, the early industrialization, when this frustration came up of people who then became the Romantic poets in England and in Germany, they tried to develop a counter theory about the world, saying, well, the world is not what utilitarians say it is in measuring and creating discipline and production. It is something that is connected to our soul. It's inside, not outside. It's nothing we can measure. It's something we have to feel. When we are in the mountains and we have this feeling of awe, that's what life is about, and not production and work and factories. Capitalism has somehow captured that idea. The emotions that the Romantics saw as missing in the system have been injected with the idea that consumption makes us happy. So the idea that the consumer is somehow creating meaning and happiness through the act of consumption is the capturing of the Romantic idea in capitalism. So it's not that this narrative is without emotions. It has them, and you cannot have a narrative without emotions. If it doesn't touch our hearts, it is just stone cold and will not move people to do something. So emotions are necessary. And Greta Thunberg is the best example. It's emotional to see how a little girl showing us the mirror, saying what you did was wrong, and you keep doing it at the expense of me and my generation, and it's wrong. Loading emotions into a narrative is what is unavoidable. And again, that is something we are not used to, because we have learned with Descartes for the last 250 years that emotions are bad and reason is good. It's just recently in historical terms that psychology starts to look into emotions. We have thought emotions is bad, reason is good, reason is male, emotions is female, by the way, for Descartes, which also explains some dynamics in society that unfolded over time. And it's all storytelling.
So you say that we weave emotions into our narratives. What I was expecting you to say, and I'm kind of interested to know if this is what you think, is that actually sometimes our emotions are telling us something reasonable. Emotions are a valid ground for rationality. They're not contrary to or the enemy of rationality.
Yes,
they are the basis of true rationality. Is that how you think about these emotional touching points for true narratives or reasonable narratives?
This is basically what Jonathan Haidt, the psychologist and business ethicist at NYU in New York, has written about. He has shown that it's wrong to believe that we have emotions and we have reason and they are separate. The emotions trigger the behavior that is influenced through how we think in terms of evidence or arguments or logics. So you cannot separate the two. That is an artificial nonsense that came up with the Enlightenment. We cannot have pure reason. If we have pure reason, it's empty of life. It doesn't work.
So a reactive attitude can be reasonable because it's reactive. Thank you so much. This has been I knew it would be an absolutely outstanding seminar. It's been really great. Sadly, we have 14 open questions in the Q&A. What we'll make sure we do is we get a copy of those questions to you. So if you want to touch base with the people who've asked them, you can do, and they're really interesting. I'm sure you have another
With
hour.
pleasure.
Let me take the opportunity before we stop to advertise the next seminar, which will take place on the 17th of November. Kirsten Martin is going to be speaking about algorithmic bias and corporate responsibility, how companies hide behind the false veil of the technological imperative. It promises to be another outstanding event. But for today, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for the questions. And thank you, Guido, again for a really engaging and outstanding talk.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.